Okay, I'll start by setting our motivation for all the beings in the world, including all the creatures running around in our roof. As we were sitting here, I was thinking, how far can I expand my mind? And I was mostly thinking about kind of appreciation. How far could I expand that out? And I'm quite sure that if I can see the kindness of every being, that I could take any situation with any kind of living being and turn it into something that was wholesome and with the Dharma. So these kind of thoughts make me really appreciate the Dharma and its power, and that makes me appreciate the Buddha and our teachers. And by taking any little piece that I really have some confidence in, conviction in, I can use that to help me to take on all the parts of the Dharma slowly, and think about actually really transforming, changing, improving, letting go of things. So really taking advantage of the opportunity that we have, preparing for teachings, having the opportunity to give them, to listen, and using this to put ourselves in a situation to really be able to help others, shoring up our convictions in liberation especially. And then working to make that a possibility for everyone. So find a way to do that in your own mind. So Venerable Children is in Australia, down under, and she'll be back in a couple of weeks. And so tonight we're going to review, I picked up where Venerable John Pell left off, and the next session after he spoke was on February 4th. And so I took a look at that teaching and spent some time with it this week, and then kind of rearranged. So this was in the section on the mind training like rays of the sun, mind training like rays of the sun, right before she finished the very end of the conventional Bodhicitta section. And so where we are is we're in, when they do the 7 points of thought transformation, we're at the very end of the 7th point. And this text, mind training like rays of the sun, reverses the order. In the 7-point thought transformation, they do the ultimate bodhicitta first, and then they go into the conventional, and this mind training, like rays of the sun, reverses it. And so this is kind of the last teaching on the conventional bodhicitta, and then after this she goes into ultimate bodhicitta. So we're still in the slogans of point 7. So the first one, the translation wasn't very good, so she used a different translation, which was be liberated by 2, examination and analysis. And so I think the main thing for me is 2 parts to this. First is that we're liberated, and really thinking about that. We need to think about this, I think, a lot, and to develop renunciation. And in order to really develop renunciation, according to Geshe Sopa, that includes this conviction that liberation is a for real thing. It's not just wanting to be free from suffering and having compassion for ourselves. It's also cultivating the conviction that liberation is possible. And Geshe Tekchok talks about that there are 2 methods to see the unsatisfactory nature, unsatisfactoriness of cyclic existence. And these are to look at the Four Noble Truths and to look at the 12 links of dependent arising. And when you do that, this is how we can generate this determination to be free and this wish for liberation. So as I was going through this talk, I really kept in the back of my mind renunciation and the 12 links especially, because a lot of this talk kind of brings it up, and I think it's really worth kind of placing that context there, so that as we learn about different points about the afflictions and working with the afflictions, that we think about getting away from them. And in the big picture, I think in my own self, sometimes I'm just thinking about this life. Mostly I'm thinking about this life, this day, this hour, this moment, and wanting to be happy. But I think it's really, actually really helpful for the mind to think a lot bigger than that, and to put the teachings in a really positive framework. And we talk about that a lot here, of kind of how much, it's hard to see so many things about ourselves that our teacher, Venerable Chodron, and our other teachers who are so strong and skilled, they point out a lot. And so we're learning and seeing things. And then we, as students, talk a lot about having to see the positive side of things, because we get kind of weighed down sometimes with seeing all of our dirt. We have to remember, and actually when I listen to these teachings, I'm quite aware that they're teaching us both of them, but I'm only hearing a lot of times the ones that kind of weigh me down, because they just weigh me down and I go down with it, But when I go back and listen, I always see the other side is presented. I just have not always so attuned to it in the moment. And so I think bringing that to mind, and bringing it to mind in a really big way. So as we go through some of these points, I'll try to come back to that a little bit. So, okay, be liberated by 2, examination and analysis. So examination, which is also investigation, and analysis, these are 2 of the changeable mental factors. And so investigation was something that examined kind of the general details of something, and then analysis examined the specifics. And they were changeable because, in the sense of they were, they could go to things that were either virtuous or non-virtuous. So you could examine you could analyze buying a car in order to get the car that would make your image be the best, and do things that were really shore up your reputation, and those kind of things. And that would be one kind of analysis, but that would be kind of mixed in with unwholesomeness. What you could also do analysis where you're trying to figure out about the self and liberating yourself and things like that. And so looking at the nature of the person is analysis also, but that's more on the virtuous side of things, because you're usually trying to do that to with some motivation that's going to be virtuous and get away from suffering. So that's why they call it changeable. And in much of this talk, the whole talk, she kind of goes through a lot of this, although she doesn't come back to those points, but it's there. So the investigation is when we look at the mind, and in this context of Lojong or mind training, we're looking more at the afflictions and what's stronger, what's more frequent, and things like that. And that takes some time. Just, as you learn about the afflictions, people ask this often, like, well, which ones should I work on? And it's actually it wasn't so obvious to me right off the bat as I learned about these things. I remember going through the process of watching my mind, and then as you do that more and more, just like with anything you do repetitively, you start seeing which things come up more frequently, what situations come up, and as you apply the understanding of the Dharma, then that's naturally, you learn which afflictions are more prominent and more troublesome for you. So I think that's, maybe people have different experiences, but I know people have asked that question a lot. So you're also, when you're investigating, you're looking at what situations they come up in. The analysis goes a little deeper though, and this is where she spent a lot of time. And this is where you're looking at what provokes the arising of the afflictions. So now you've kind of identified which is your main affliction and which are your main ones and kind of the general things, but this is looking at what in the Lam Rim they call the 6 conditions for the arising of afflictions. And so, although she didn't list these all out, she actually went through them, most of them, in this talk. So I thought I would list them out and then kind of bring them up as they go along. So the first one was predispositions for afflictions. And this is like having the seed of the potential. And this really takes us back to the 12 links. Because when you look at how we're stuck in cyclic existence, it starts with ignorance, and then it goes to karma, and then it goes to consciousness. And that consciousness are the actions that you've done through ignorance are kind of planted in this consciousness. There's like 2 parts to that, and so you're planting it. And this is kind of the latencies that we have. So we have these predispositions, and based on those, we just circle around in cyclic existence. So that's one thing. And the second one of these conditions for the arising of afflictions is contact with objects, which she then goes to at length, and that's what we'll go into first. The third one was detrimental influences. She also spent some time on that. Then verbal stimuli, which is things like media and internet, and just what you surround yourself with, all the different food of information that we take in, all the different things we take into our mind. Not verbal, but maybe even more than that. And then habit. And this included emotional habits. And this is, again, when you look at the 12 links, that second link of karma are these actions that we do. So we have this ignorance that's like, the ignorance that's in the 12 links is the one that is the view of the transitory collection, or what she's now calling the personal identity. So here you are with this strong sense of me, feeling so real, and then boom, out of that, all the things that arise from the inherently existent me, that kind of active ignorance, you do actions. And a lot of those actions that you do are going to be ones that you've created propensities for already because of the habit. The results of karma are these habits. So, kind of tying it back in. So we have these habits, including emotional habits. And then the 6th one is the inappropriate attention, which she didn't speak about much in this talk, but I thought was worth bringing up a little bit. Because inappropriate attention has been a little hard to wrap my mind around at first, when it was first taught. But really, I think I understand it better and I see it in myself better if I just say this is when we're really kind of honing in on the negative parts of a situation. And so in my own life, where that leads to is sometimes if you stay with negative thoughts a lot, your mind just gets completely pulled down by that. And as your mind has this kind of unwholesome flavor going on, you're actually opening the door to all of the afflictions, which is why we always want to have, like they say, like in Shantideva, you can't really practice unless you have the guards of mindfulness and introspective alertness, because any practice you have just gets thrown out the window when you don't have that. So when you're staying with this inappropriate attention and letting your mind stay in this negativity, and I know this just because I do this so much, all the negativities, because you aren't being mindful of virtue, your mind can't even stay attending on virtuous objects. It gets just distracted away to other things. And so the afflictions just can grow and grow. And that, to me, leads to like despondency. And so when I think of this inappropriate attention, I really think about that's where it leads to. And of course, we all have that kind of mind state come up now and then. But I think what Shantideva said really makes most sense. It's like earlier in Shantideva's book, he talks about when you fall down, it's kind of like no big deal, just get up again. We all fall down. But in our culture and in our upbringing, we just feel like failures when we fall down. And so it's really the mind that is, the falling down isn't the problem. It's not getting up. That's the problem. Like little kids, they fall down all the time when they're learning to walk. If they just stayed down, they'd never learn how to walk. And so it's the same thing. Oftentimes the way Shantideva talks about this is just so helpful for my mind. He says here about despondency, without indulging in despondency. It's like given that you're going to go there now and then, but it's the indulging in it. So he says, without indulging in despondency, I should gather the supports for enthusiasm and earnestly take control of myself. Then by seeing the equality between self and others, I should practice exchanging self for others. And so that, to me, that whole verse just takes you from like this low, kind of takes you right out of that, taking control of yourself and then putting you into bodhicitta, a mind of bodhicitta. And this is in the section in Shantideva about joyous effort. So then he says, gather the supports for enthusiasm, which are, this is a later verse, the supports when working for the sake of living beings are aspiration, steadfastness, which also is conviction, confidence, joy and rest. So aspiration, steadfastness, joy and rest. And aspiration is developed through fear of misery and by contemplating the benefits of aspiration itself. In my experience, these things are absolutely true. Aspiration is always beneficial for my mind, and there's a part of my mind that it just wants to get out of misery, and it's like, ah. And then there's also this part of my mind that just feels like this in itself is beneficial to do, just the act of having aspiration. So that's, I think, kind of related to the inappropriate attention. And I wanted to say something about that because that's the one thing she didn't go into. Okay, so then back to Venerable's talk. She basically said, look and see which afflictions are stronger and what circumstances or what's the external thing that's going on that habitually makes afflictions arise. And then when you really look at that question, that one way to look at that are these 6 conditions. And contact is the one that she spoke about the most in terms of this section. And so first she talked about it in terms of like kind of the contact. Contact is when you what is it, your eye consciousness, or your one of your consciousness meets with the object. There's 3 parts. The part that your consciousness meeting, and then there's the object, and there's another part of that. I think it's the organ that does it. Is that right?
There's the object, there's the organ, there's the consciousness.
Yeah, object, organ, and consciousness. So basically, you're seeing things, you're hearing things, you're having, it's not like, you can actually look at something and not take everything in. So you have to have the consciousness part there. There's the organ itself is almost like a camera when you think of vision. The eye organ kind of sees stuff, but you have to then register it. So that's like the consciousness. So when you're doing that, that's contact. And so a lot of times, it's like when we see things that we don't like, then we kind of like anger kind of comes up, and when we see things that we do like, then we easily get attached. And this kind of yo-yoing of the mind with attachment and anger really creates a lot of suffering and creates a lot of afflictions. And we're actually kind of, if you look at it in one way, we're actually distracted by these things. Like, say, if you think about it when you're on the meditation cushion, when they define distraction as a mental factor, this is exactly what they're talking about. Unable to direct the mind towards a wholesome object, disperses it to a variety of other objects. It causes the power of concentration to deteriorate and acts as a basis for losing one's attention upon the objects referred to when you're both doing analytical and stabilizing meditation. So it's a quality ascribed to a state of mind in which hatred or bewilderment have come up. Hatred, attachment, or bewilderment. So basically, it's this restlessness of our mind that takes us away from virtuous things. And so they say that it's kind of this natural restlessness, and I think when you've done retreat, you start to get a sense of that. There's just a part of your mind that is kind of restless, and you have to learn how to work with that. And so when they talk about distraction, this is actually what they're talking. This is how they define the mental factor. So, then we easily go to attachment and aversion for things upon contact. So this brings up the second thing about verbal stimuli, like media. And Venerable used this expression that like media easily causes afflictions to arise because it wears at your mind. And I thought that was quite, a good way to put it. Especially if it's something that you're kind of, more like hooked into. It's so much easier then to, when it's just presented so well, because the media has a lot of tools. They've got people researching and figuring out how we get hooked into things, and then they just put it out there for us. I mean, I just remember watching my nephew when he was playing video games, and the ones that were actually not so ones that you really want, they were actually so well done, and the ones that were a little more like wholesome, they were so boring, I mean, I could see why, and you just get drawn in. So that's part of contact, and also different kind of stimuli that we put ourselves around. Even when we see movies, these images kind of stay with your mind afterwards. And so really it's a thing about where are we putting our attention and recognizing the influences that what we're around. And so Venerable says, we really have to be smart about this. We need to see what kind of situations not to put ourselves in simply because of the power of the object. She said the power of the object is too strong for us. And this was really interesting for me to look at, because I can remember years ago being around a group of people, and this person was really heavily getting into drugs, but everybody else was too. And I remember being with this group of people and saying, look, can't you see this person is really going under with this? We need to clean up our act and support this person. And no one could see it. Everyone was so into it. It was so intense. and I've watched, drug addiction, in people that I know quite well, and I can remember just so much kind of understanding, why aren't they strong enough to get out of this? And it's not really recognizing just this, the power of the object. Things really hook us in. And for us as monastic, this is why, one of the reasons we take monastic precepts, and Venerable talked about this, and I thought it was quite a good thing to remember. And same thing for people who are taking lay precepts. It's the same idea applies. But especially with monastic precepts, you're even more limiting these kind of situations. And why are we doing this? It's not like we're trying to run away. It's not like we're trying to get away from the afflictions. But we're trying to get ourselves out of situations where the afflictions are so strong and overpowering that we'll be overwhelmed. And boom, we won't really be able to apply the antidotes. That's exactly what she said. And I think that's exactly the case with things that are overpowering. I just know when my own mind feels overwhelmed, I can't use the antidotes. You know, it doesn't, you know, I study a lot in my own mind, when do the antidotes not work? And there's a number of things, and we've been talking about this lately, and that's one of them. The feeling of being overwhelmed, definitely, it's like almost virtually impossible then. It's like when people ask about anger and they say, well, what do you do when you're in the throes of anger? Well, you know, the antidotes, it's a little too late then. You have to do the work before that. And so this is what Venerable's trying to tell us here. It's like, don't put yourselves in those situations. And sometimes we can't see it, you know. But so we're not doing it really to escape, and we're not going to be away from our mental afflictions when we restrict our environment, but they're going to be more moderate, and we're going to have an easier time seeing them. And if we're with people who are like-minded, they're going to help us to even see these things. Much as we don't always like it, later we appreciate it, you know. But the more that we can have these things come up in a more manageable way, or, you know, more moderate way, then we can actually use the ways of thinking that really combat them. And so this is, then she talked about, which I think is really kind of key, is not being arrogant and thinking that we can avoid these things. Like, I see that in myself sometimes as even a stubbornness, you know, and thinking, oh, I can handle this, I've got mindfulness, I can transform things. And, you know, we have to look at our own habits. This is the conditions, again, of how afflictions arise. One of them is our habits, including our emotional habits, and one of those is pride and arrogance, and and that's so hard to recognize, and it comes up in so many different ways. So, yeah. I was thinking of, I watched this video today, the end of the Thich Nhat Hanh video, and it was just so interesting to me, because the last person who asked the question was asking about anger. She said, it was so funny, because it's kind of like my experience. Before I moved to Plum Village, I didn't have so much anger. I had anger, but it wasn't so much, and it didn't last so long. That was her question. I'm like, that sounds a little familiar, you know. And you know, they're a long-established community, and they have kind of interesting names and creative ways of using the Vinaya and the teachings to kind of go after these things. And so they had kind of like a peace treaty kind of idea. And the basic rule of their community, and the young woman was asking, can I have 48 hours instead of 24? Because their rule is, you can, when you have anger, work on it for 24 hours. But if at that point you don't really have it worked out, then you need to get help, essentially. And it was like, there were 3 things you had to do. And if you couldn't say them in a kind way, you had to write them down and give them to the person. And your first thing was kind of like, I'm suffering. I'm having this anger. And the second one was like, and I'm working with it, I'm practicing with it. And then he said, implying that you're going to practice with it too. And then the third one was like, asking for help. I need help. And then what he said about that was, and the reason people don't always do this is because of pride. And even when you do this, your suffering will decrease. Because you start out with, I am suffering. You know, and I just thought, wow, that is so true, that you know, what he said was, you'll just go away, go to your room, and distance yourself off, and do whatever, cry, whatever you'll do. But you still have pride there. And I thought, yeah, that's exactly it. You know, and so it's just so hard to find these things. You know, and so that's why I appreciate the teaching so much in these teachers. So, you know, that's like, what's that? That's the emotional habit. And so we have to recognize this is a condition. This is like what we're bringing along. This is what's circling us around in samsara. And then the next thing she talked about, which was kind of still under contact, but also, I think, related to this detrimental influences, was the friends that we choose, and how the friends that we choose have quite an impact on what afflictions arise and if they arise. And she mentioned, like, ask anyone in AA, if you hang around people who drink, will you not drink? You know, I mean, they just know you can't do that. It's just, some things are too powerful. And so I think it's what we call that sometimes bad friends, but the real thing there is they are not bad people. That's not the way to take those words, bad friends. They are not bad people at all. The problem is our mind. The problem is not them. It's not the other person. And the problem with our mind is that we have tendencies that hook us in, essentially. And then when she talked about this, I think this is worth repeating, is that, because you hear this come up a lot with people, is that when you get into the Dharma, sometimes this kind of related to your old friends, you know, you're making new friends obviously, but you have all these old friends, and things are like changing a lot. And so oftentimes people get confused because they kind of feel like, you know, I'm not hanging out with these people as much, and you know, kind of what's going on here, because it can be this is just a change, things change. But she was saying, you know, that's actually quite natural, because you're actually protecting your mind more, you're watching your mind more, and you're kind of more than naturally drawn to people that, you know, are kind of doing the same thing. And also she mentioned, which is also true, you're always changing friends, even if it wasn't for a Dharma reason. It's just, you know, if you look over your life, you might have people that you know, but kind of the people you're really hanging around with, it's a constant flux. So let's see. That was the first slogan, and that was my favorite of the bunch to talk about. So the next slogan in this talk was, don't be boastful. And then she's gonna, you know how Venerable is, and so now I'm going to tell you about all my good qualities. Everything I've accomplished, you know. She always kind of mimicked, when she did most of these slogans, she first kind of mimicked them. Like, it was kind of funny. The text on this says, the commentary says, do not boast of the little good you've done for others by repeatedly reminding them of it. And then she says, well, you know, you Dharma practitioners, you kind of work this out. You realize you can't really say it because it's not so kosher. We all pick that up after a while. Can't toot their own horn anymore. But inside, in our mind, we're still thinking it, even though we don't say it a lot of times. And then she kind of looks at, well, why does that happen? You know, what's going on there? And she had a couple of ways of looking at it. I thought this was true for the things I would say in me is like, after everything I've done for you, look how you treat me. You know, because that comes up in the mind. You know, you just feel like, I'm working so hard, and they don't even say thank you. So, you know, what is really going on there? And the thing she brought up a lot was this idea of that we're raised with in our culture about justice, and things have to be fair. And she really likened that to like a business transaction. That you know, in that way we're treating our relationships like a business deal. You know, I give you this, so you should give me that. I did this, you should do that. And then well, for sure, when our mind goes in that direction, you know, of wanting this kind of appreciation or thank you or any of these kind of things, we haven't really thought that the action that we've done, we haven't really thought about karma, and that we could be maybe content with just creating causes, but you know, we don't really think about, or even when someone doesn't necessarily give us what we want, we don't really think of it in terms of like one of the results of karma. We've created this situation. You know, that's kind of how we're in this situation. And a lot of times we don't think of that, at least not without reflection. So then she said, and this is what I thought, well, just listen and see what your mind does. Have you noticed how we say, after everything I've done for you, why are you treating me this way? We never say, after everything you've done for me, why am I treating you this way? I don't ever think that like that. Bingo. And then she goes on to talk about her parents in that regard, you know. And so this is when they talk about very bright people who, although you're very bright and intelligent, this is one of the benefits of listening to the Dharma. Because we don't pick up on a lot of these things on our own. We have to be taught some of these things. And this is, they teach about that when they teach about, in the Lam Rim, where they teach about listening to the Dharma. This is one of their big points. Okay, so she said that we treat our parents sometimes like they're employees. You had me, so now you've got to serve me, kind of thing. I kind of remember thinking that, actually. You know, you brought me into the world. It's your problem. I remember thinking that once. So that's not the attitude we want to have. So then, let's see the commentary back to that. Do not boast of the little good you've done for others by repeatedly reminding them of it. If it were proper to boast of the little good you've done, the transcendent destroyer, the Buddha, would have said so, but he didn't. That was the commentary. And Venerable said he not only didn't say so, he didn't even do that. He never said, you know, look at all I've done for you. I practiced for 3 countless great eons. You know, he doesn't go there. And then I think this was in another commentary that she brought this up, but it wasn't so clear. But anyway, mainly she said, especially don't boast about our practice. Don't talk about in that boastful, for that purpose, you know, I've done this and this, and I've had these great experiences and done these retreats. It actually will diminish your own benefit, I think, that you get from them when you do that. So what she's saying, to replace this with something more wholesome, is actually see that working for sentient beings is really the only natural and right thing to do, and that we've actually taken the Bodhisattva vow, many of us. So we've actually made this pledge already. And then when you make pledges, you know, you've already promised something, then what's the point, you know, especially when you've done something very, you know, voluntarily, and with a very clear mind, you know, this is what I want to do with this life and all future lives, when you take that vow. So what's the point of, you know, kind of needing to be boastful about things? You're just doing what you said you would do. Kind of like I said I would make lunch. You know, it's not that big of a deal. And then she kind of goes, I think, what I would say, into the advantages and disadvantages, and, you know, like, what does it really do to our mind when we're boastful? And we had some nice discussion on this and that, and so I kind of brought these things in from the Q&A to this part. So she was saying it makes us quite unrealistic when we're boastful, like we're putting ourselves up, puffing ourselves up. And also the thing about the business relationships, that's also kind of unrealistic. But I think it was Venerable Simke that was saying that when we are kind of in that kind of mind state of boasting and arrogance and stuff, we're actually taking us away from other beings. And, you know, we really do want to be close to others, but it really pulls us away. We actually are distancing ourselves then. Because whether you do it like the pride that where you're a notch above people, or the inverted pride where you're a notch below, you're always separating yourselves. And then I think it was Sundru who talked about how when we have arrogance, we actually aren't looking at ourselves realistically, and when we're not looking at ourselves realistically, then we're trying to do our Dharma practice. Kind of the base, I think is how you said it, the base that we're coming from isn't really, you know, we don't even have it, you know, it's not an authentic base, I think were the words. And so Venerable went on to say, yeah, we're not only distancing ourselves from others, but we're distancing ourselves from ourselves in that place. And then, how can you do a Dharma practice when you aren't seeing yourself realistically? She talked about, that this is also how the feelings of alienation come up. We have this I grasping, and then we kind of just divide into superior and inferior. And basically, she said it's all a bunch of useless conceptualization. So if we can't really look at ourselves honestly, then we can't really have a Dharma practice. That's kind of what it boils down to in terms of practice. So if we see ourselves boasting, we know we've got to kind of look at why. What are we doing? What are we painting? Because it's not actually so real. It's based on, pride is based on this wrong view of the self. And then John Pell in this said, they also, if you already think you're a great practitioner, then what's the point of practicing? It's a good point. Why bother? You don't need to. You're not seeing yourself the way the Buddha taught. The thing of seeing yourself as a patient. This is why I think they have that teaching. So we will take it in the sense of, hey, we have something that we want to change. And also, if we don't really don't exert ourselves then in our practice, we'll become complacent. And this, she said, is actually a mental factor, and it's like one that is just completely deadly for a spiritual practice. She said that they also call this haughtiness when you study the mental factors. So maybe another word for it is self-satisfied. And so the other way to kind of look at these things is, instead of boasting about our practice or anything, we can just rejoice at the merit. And my teacher, Darshan Rinpoche, always, whenever we were doing things, because Saturday was the big volunteer day at the Sakya Monastery, so we were always doing things then. And whenever we finished something, he would just go, "We did it." And that's what sticks in my mind. And I just realized, wow, he was teaching us about how to rejoice. And it definitely works. When we do something together and we just finish it and we did it and it feels so good. It's completely wholesome. And it's not boasting at all. It's just really rejoicing in what we have done. And it makes you feel happy right then. Then the next slogan was, don't be short-tempered. You should not express dissatisfaction with the size of offerings and rewards, or you will breach the commitment not to grumble. That was the commentary. And everybody here just cracked up when we heard about grumbling. It was funny. I think she applied this to a lot of situations, and the one about offerings didn't do much for me really, but we had a discussion here about teachers. You were talking with Venerable about this in the Q&A, like sometimes when you're teaching, it's kind of unusual, even teaching kids in school, that anyone ever says thank you, and your mind can kind of go south a little bit with, you put in so much effort for a year. Sometimes I don't actually remember. I was thinking about that. I never remember in all my elementary school, at least, that we ever thanked the teachers. I don't remember that. And even after that, I probably was mostly giving them grief, so. I only thought about elementary school when I thought about that. I don't remember that ever happening. And then, but for me, what comes up more is like the projects that we're working on. And, I did this and I did that, and somebody else gets the credit and things like that. This kind of, still it's this thing of justice and fairness, balancing the scales. Venerable's take on that was that that's really big more in the U.S. and that doesn't happen so much outside of our culture. I don't know. But she said, what she did say about us, and I think this is true, is that it's easy to talk about, but when you're in the situation, it's easy to get quite incensed in these situations. And then she talked about, well, how would a bodhisattva do this? You know, when a bodhisattva is, you know, kind of working for sentient beings, do they, you know, do they go in that direction? Not at all. And also, the other thing she said, which made me laugh, was like, she was talking about, it's not fair. You did the water bowls. You know, I did the water bowls yesterday. Why do I have to do them today? And we don't even think about, you know, water bowls. This is like merit. This is like when we hear merit, our mind should think happiness. That's what I got out of this. You know, I don't think about it that way all the time, but it really is. Merit is the cause of happiness. So whenever you hear the word merit, just think happiness, and you know, this is like creating the causes. So let's see. Another translation of this "don't be short-tempered" was "do not retaliate," and this is the same thing of kind of the business relationship a little bit, like keeping track of harms given to us and seeking revenge, and this kind of weighing the scales and things like that. And so then she talked about, you know, looking at the advantages and disadvantages, so that we would kind of see, like, I don't know, it kind of made you want to change. Like, how do you feel when other people are kind of grumbling and complaining? You know, how do we feel when we're around people that are complaining? And so she say, you know, instead of like starting to grumble and complain yourself, which is easy for the mind to go to, just kind of look at it and, you know, say like, you know, I don't really want to put that energy out into the world, and so I'm going to be more attentive to my own behavior, my own mindfulness, and so don't complain about the complainers. And then, I thought this was insightful. She says, I guess that's why they say the things we don't like in ourselves we see in others. I think that's kind of true. Like when we bump into each other, the things that we kind of have trouble with, you know, the things that kind of get to us. There was another way to work with this, not from her teaching, but I think is quite useful, and when things about retaliation, short-temperedness, has a lot to do with anger. And anger and attachment are basically the basis of the 8 worldly concerns, right? Which is how we spend a lot of our time. And so then the Chinese, they often call it the 8 winds, which I actually like because it has the whole beautiful image of you're just kind of buffeted around by them. And I think that is... I like images that kind of lift my mind. And so when they talk about one antidote that's talked about, at least in the Pali tradition, which also has this teaching, is about equanimity. And equanimity is one of the 4 immeasurables. And that word is Brahma Viharas, which actually translates as divine abodes or shelters. So it has this sense of protection. So the 4 immeasurable attitudes, is what we call it, are the 4 Brahma Viharas, the 4 divine abodes or shelters. And so it's looking at equanimity in a way that helps to give us more balance. This person called it ballast against the 8 winds. You know, like in a ship. A ship is really unsteady unless it has ballast in the bottom to make it steady. So the 8 winds of the worldly concerns, which we're talking here about attachment and anger, which is basically, you know, what do not retaliate comes there. So how their suggestion, the way they went about cultivating it, was by developing a very calm mind. And that makes a lot of sense to me, because none of our antidotes, you can't use them unless you have enough calmness in the mind and mindfulness. So, talking about equanimity, the way they brought this up, I thought was quite realistic to our own experiences, because our own experience, or mine is that a lot of times it feels like you're tossed around. This sense of being tossed around, blown around by circumstances, by our own mind, by our own reactions. You know, it's kind of just blowing us around. And so they're really grounding it in essentially ethics. If you can hold your ethics and hold your conduct in these situations, why we always want to think about our body and our speech, then even if you don't have pure equanimity in your mind, you will be more equanimous because you will have controlled your body and your speech. And that's, I think, quite realistic for us to go towards. This was also the teaching about equanimity, where they talked about that the far enemy of equanimity is rage. So that means kind of like, they just don't exist in the mind at the same time. You can't have that huge amount of anger and have equanimity. But then they also talked about what's more subtle is the near enemy, which is indifference or apathy. And so that means that having equanimity can also kind of, if you aren't doing it right, you actually could be apathetic or indifferent. And that's not what you want. So their experience told them, or I'm assuming it was from their experiences, to look at the connection that's happening with other beings. When you have equanimity, there's a feeling of connection, and when you have indifference, you don't have connection. And I think that's quite, well put, easy to understand. So, let's see what else. Decide here. Okay, so just another slogan. The next one that came up was, "Don't be fickle." And this also was, I could see in my training book, it was "Don't make a short-lived attempt," but a different translation was "Don't be fickle." And this was the idea of how it's so easy to start something with a lot of enthusiasm and then fizzle out. And that habit is really not a very good one to cultivate. And especially, she was talking about in terms of our Dharma practice and how this happens sometimes where, you just get real jazzed about one practice and then you kind of, well, now it's boring, and you drop that, and then you pick up another one and drop that. And this teacher is good, and then you kind of, well, that's not so good, and you go on to the next one, or this Dharma center. And basically what happens with that is that you never can go deep into anything, because you're just always just like shifting winds, you're just going here to here to here. Not that you don't need to change things, and not that everything that you do is going to work out, but looking for that tendency, I think, is the main thing, is being able to stay with things and not getting bored. She said that a lot of the reason she thinks that we get to boredom in things is because we have this consumer mentality where we have just so much to choose from that we feel like it's just our prerogative that when something kind of loses a little bit of zip, on to the next thing, It's like 21 flavors, and okay, I've had enough of this one, I'm going on to the next one. And then we had quite an interesting discussion about boredom then, which was kind of a lot to do with the dissatisfied mind that wants this big hit. But then also Kathleen asked, how do you deal with boredom when it comes up? What's the antidote of the moment? was the question. And Venerable says, well, since I started practicing the Dharma, that doesn't really happen very much. And then so what she said is, you just study boredom. When it comes up in your mind, you just turn your mind and look at it. What does it feel like, and how does it come about, and what are the effects? And then actually just by doing that, the boredom kind of dissolves. And if she also said if she just really gets bored, she does meditations on Bodhicitta, at least for her personal practice. And then Venerable Simke was talking about in the reflections on this that for her, she had found that she wouldn't maybe let herself get bored, because she would think that one of her sessions was kind of not a very good session if she got bored. So she would tend to kind of have a lot of proliferation coming up and stories and kind of keeping the adrenaline going. And she said what she figured out is that that's how she was keeping herself awake. And so that when she got her handle on that and her mind wasn't proliferating, then it would settle down, and then she would kind of get bored and fall asleep. And so, she had to really kind of look at this. And also, the reason that she would fall asleep, though, is actually partly that she was seeing how she was so worn out by, the mind that's kind of doing that all the time. It wears you out. But it was pretty funny, the connections that she made between all of these things. Might help somebody, because sleepiness is something that comes up for people. So I think what I took out of that, because I can see in my own practice, is that mental fatigue definitely can make you sleepy. And then you had a really good question that night about what's the source of this dissatisfied mind, that goes to boredom, and is it just the craving? And this is where Venerable talked about different kinds of dissatisfaction. There's the one that's just straight out like the craving, which is the attachment. You're kind of in the attachment mode. But there's also frustrated craving, which is I want, but I'm not getting it, And so you kind of stay stuck in that. And I think we can see that living in community that, people have different ones that they spend more time in. I think I go more into the frustrated craving mode, because what happens is you don't have it met, and so you get frustrated. You go into anger. So let's just skip to the last part. Because it talked about this a little bit. At the very end of this talk, she how do I present this? The next teaching, the very end, she started talking a little bit about ultimate bodhicitta. And so she spent some time redefining conventional and ultimate bodhicitta. And when she was talking about conventional bodhicitta and ultimate bodhicitta, she was saying that what ultimate bodhicitta is really the wish to have the realization of emptiness directly. That was her definition of it. And then John Pell was asking, well, if that's ultimate bodhicitta, then do the arhats have that? And it was quite a interesting question, really. And basically, it's kind of like just the way, somewhat the way the words are used. Arhats definitely develop the realization of emptiness directly, but they don't have necessarily bodhicitta because they haven't worked on that. So in order to call it ultimate bodhicitta, you have to have cultivated the conventional bodhicitta. So the word bodhicitta, when you just hear that word, it's usually referring to conventional bodhicitta, which is the altruistic intention, this aspiration to become a Buddha in order to benefit others. And ultimate then is the wish to realize emptiness directly. And then she talked about this full conventional wisdom really requires having the ultimate bodhicitta. And so you could have a realization of bodhicitta without having a realization of emptiness, but it wouldn't be full. And that then led into your question and mine, which we'll end with this bit about bodhicitta. My question was, why is it that you don't? I remember I had just read something about how our realizations aren't permanent. So I was thinking, yeah, they aren't. They come and they go. And they aren't that stable. So why would bodhicitta be stable? Because in my mind I was thinking, without the realization of emptiness, I didn't quite see why bodhicitta would be stable. And basically it works like this. She taught about the 5 paths, accumulation, preparation, seeing, meditation, and no more learning. And this first path, the path of accumulation, you enter that path when you generate bodhicitta. And it has like 3 stages, and once you get to the middle or the last stage, then your bodhicitta is stable. But you still haven't necessarily directly realized emptiness directly at that point. That doesn't come till the 3rd path, the path of seeing, right? So I still was like, okay, nice, but why? What makes it so stable? I mean, what makes it be stable? And she said, basically, you've cultivated compassion in a very stable way. You have some understanding of emptiness, and so you're working on that. And also, some people, by the time they've even entered the path of accumulation, the first path, they've actually worked on their concentration and have serenity. And so these things, all of these things together, was what were because my question was, what are the causes that stabilize it? And this is what her response was. And then your question to her was, well, what makes it full bodhicitta? And she said, well, it's when it's conjoined with the realization of emptiness. And then she said maybe the word full wasn't exactly the best word, but basically what she was pointing to is that the bodhicitta that we will develop when we're on the path of accumulation, when we have the full direct realization of emptiness, it will just kind of bring it up a whole notch. It will change the quality of it. So I think, I don't know, I find it inspiring to think about the paths. So we'll end with that. His Holiness says, spiritual practice is difficult in the beginning. You may wonder how on earth you can ever do it, but as you get used to it, the practice gradually becomes easier. Don't be too stubborn or push yourself too hard. If you practice in accord with your individual capacity, little by little you will find more pleasure and joy in it. And as you gain inner strength, your positive actions will gain in profundity and scope. So we'll try to end with that thought and send this out to all the people who need something immediately. Send them all good energy. And think about becoming enlightened in order to help all beings.